Welcome back, everybody. It's time once again to Finding Your Soul in Success, where leaders share their inspirational wisdom and stories with our friend Kathy Gardarian. Welcome.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Kathy Gardarian, and today I'm so delighted to be with my friend and cohort in business. At least we do some things together. It's Dr. Amir Raz. He's a leading cognitive neuroscientist and educator. He received a PhD in brain science and neuropsychology from the Center for Computational Neuroscience at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He later went on to a postdoctoral fellowship at the Weill Medical College at Cornell University. He was also on the faculty of Columbia University as well as the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Today, Dr. Raz is a professor of psychiatry, neurology, neurosurgery, and psychology at McGill University in Montreal. He is also the founding director of the Brain Institute at Chapman University. Now, but before Dr. Raz became an accomplished neuroscientist and educator, he was first known as a professional magician and entertainer. Now, I really want you to tell me a little bit more about how you started doing that, and also what you call magic and deception in science.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this kind and generous introduction, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
I am, I have to remind myself every now and then that I'm a magician because I visit Magic Castle in LA now a lot more than I have in my entire life because I was on the East Coast before.
Right.
And now that I'm on the West Coast, Magic Castle is like the mecca of magicians. It's in LA.
It's so much fun. Yeah.
It is a lot of fun, and
Yeah.
it's a major hub for magicians. And every time I go there, I meet old friends and things like that. And it's really interesting, these silos of magic and science, because they usually don't intersect. You have very few magicians who are scientists.
Oh, interesting.
And very
Yeah.
few scientists who are magicians. And people always ask me, are you the best magician among the scientists, or are you the best scientist among the magicians? And, my canned answer is I'm neither one. I'm neither the best magician among the scientists or the best scientist among the magicians, because I don't think that there is such a thing. It's not a competition, really, but there's something really interesting about the question that you posed.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a magician and deception and to do science? And the reason that it's interesting is because in general, what do we think about magicians? What's the stigma that is usually, or the aura that goes with, or the connotation that goes with magicians? It's usually somebody who's a snake in the grass, like a deceptive trickster, somebody who's willing to sell, his dear ones for an effect. Somebody who's sort of very much into, the audience applauding at all costs kind of thing, with all kinds of back doors and trap doors and gaffed props and stuff like that. What is a scientist? It's the antithesis of that, right?
Yes, absolutely.
A scientist needs to be some kind of a dignified, honest, upstanding member of society, somebody who's intelligent and honest and forthcoming and transparent, almost like the diametrical opposition of a magician. Well, I'm both. And I'm sort of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde in one person. And it's very interesting because when I do science, I make sure that I do science according to scientific paradigms and norms of behavior and so on. And when I'm a magician, I allow myself to get into magical behavior, which includes deception and so on. And there's a gray zone. There's a twilight zone in between them, because in science, you can actually sometimes, with permission, use deception. Deception is not all bad. And part of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to demonstrate, for example, in my psychological experiments, in my neuroscientific experiments, that we have a lot to learn from what deception does to the human brain or to the human mind, because in our life and as we navigate life, we deal with a lot of deception. Some of the deception comes from our peers. Some of the deception comes from, things that happen in our work environment, in our social dynamic. Deception is part of life. So to ignore it and to say, oh, people are not deceptive, or we never have to deal with trickery, with subterfuge, with, things that have to do with people masquerading as something that they're not, and so on, that doesn't work. I mean, so learning about what deception is, how does the brain deal with deception, what can deception teach us, and so on, is a very interesting part of what we are trying to do, among other things, at the Brain Institute that I'm directing at Chapman University. And in many ways, I've been doing this for decades. The interesting thing about science is that most scientists feel, or they stop a little bit shy of asking these questions because they don't know too much about deception. They don't know too much about subterfuge, about taking concepts that have been entrenched for, if not thousands of years, then hundreds of years, with very clear principles for magic, and how do we study them in the lab? And I actually do these things.
Wow. So what does it really take to be a brain scientist? And you do so many different areas of it.
Right. So the brain science, the field of brain science, or neuroscience, as some people like to call it, is a very vast field. It's a little bit like when let's say that you meet someone and that they are let's say a cancer researcher or something. There's not one thing that is called cancer. It's like cancer is a very vast field with many kinds of cancer, many different techniques, and even the science it changes depending on what you're talking about. The same thing is with brain science and neuroscience. There's not one animal that is called a brain scientist. Brain science is a huge, vast field, and you can approach it from a computational standpoint, from a clinical standpoint. You can be a neurologist, you can be a psychiatrist, you can be a neuroradiologist, you can be an ophthalmologist, you can be a dermatologist. This is just from the clinical side. You can also be an electrophysiologist, you can be a psychologist, you can be somebody who comes from computer science and from physics. If you're doing, computational models, you can come from cellular and molecular biology, from anatomy. It's a very, very large field. Some people are getting into brain science from anthropology, from the social sciences, from sociology. So brain science has become this huge umbrella that encompasses many, many disciplines. And what is common to all of them is the interest in trying to study the brain and what the brain does as the organ of behavior, and something that has to do with our core values as humans. I mean, we have recognized over the years that you do not find your humanity in your liver or in your kidneys, not in your spleen, and not even in your heart, although this is the language that we often find in poetry and so on, but also in scripture. But we actually are humans because of our brains. This is really something that cognitively, emotionally guides our thoughts and our actions.
So how did you get interested in this when you were young? And what drew you to this?
In many ways, and I think many roads that I took led to the brain, among other things. So some of it is serendipitous, right? Some of it is just sort of by fluke, luck, whatever you want, randomness, whatever you want to call it, just somebody who's navigating the paths of life and sort of finding things and meeting people and reading books and so on. So there's certainly, an element of that. But the volitional element, the element that came from me, actually has to do with magic. So when I was a young magician, when I was going to the public library reading about coins and handkerchiefs and all these things that kids do when they're young, I encountered a group of magicians, teenage magicians, who were doing hypnosis shows. And it was very interesting for me to see how these guys who knew absolutely nothing about hypnosis, and I knew that they knew nothing about hypnosis because I would speak to them, when we were playing soccer together and when we were, doing what teenagers do, after school. I knew that they had little to no knowledge of what hypnosis even was, yet they were able to stand in front of audiences and hypnotize people who were sometimes decades older than they were. Really? And I was fascinated by that. And I asked them, how did you learn this? What did you read? And they referred me to some kind of a 12-page red booklet that they got at the local magic store. And it was just patter. It was just text that they learned by heart. It was some kind of a script that you can recite by heart, and people would sort of fall into it. And I was fascinated with the fact that you can, even theoretically, be able to utter or just articulate particular sentences or act in a certain way with some kind of a theatrical persona, and people would actually follow you to the point that they would be hypnotized or act like they're hypnotized. So I started looking into it more and more, and I started, studying psychology and things like that, and all roads led to the brain.
Wow. Pretty interesting. So this difference between being a brain scientist and a PhD and the medical world, how is that coming together for you, and what are some of the issues?
I think that's a very deep question. Like most of your questions, you phrase it, in a very light way, but actually it's a very heavy question and a very good one. Okay. A PhD, depending on the subject, a PhD is usually a person who trained to be a scientist or a researcher, somebody who's trained to do science, somebody who's trained to do research, to do a systematic study of something. An MD is usually somebody who trained to be a physician, a clinician, somebody who's certified to practice medicine. Now, we have a few variations in the United States. Sometimes you can be a DO, not just an MD. And sometimes you don't have to be a PhD. You can have similar degrees like a DSc or something like that. But at the end of the day, I was, for example, for most of my professional life, a PhD in an MD environment. I was a PhD inside of, at first it was Cornell Medical School, then it was Columbia Medical School, then it was McGill Medical School. But it's very strange to be sort of a non-clinician or a scientist or a researcher in an environment that is mostly medical or clinical, where practitioners are trying to give treatments to patients who need their help. And almost by and large, although it's not something that people speak about very much, PhDs are sort of second-class citizens in medical schools. And that's because they don't have clinical privileges and they cannot prescribe medications and so on. This is not true universally, but I would say that, this is the trend, and it's more than a trend at certain places. Now, there is an animal that is called an MD PhD, which is a person who sort of does both, but MD PhD programs are heavy on the MD and very light on the PhD in general. You can also be like an MD, like somebody who's trained to be an MD only, but an excellent researcher. And sometimes you can be a PhD and an excellent clinician, but the fact that you're a PhD and an excellent clinician does not give you the privileges or I would say the certification to practice medicine. So all these things sometimes can be very tenuous. I think that the public is sometimes confused by these things. It's not quite clear, especially when people say, I'm Dr. Raz, and it's not clear what that means even.
Sure.
There was a movement afoot a few years ago, certainly in Canada, I think in the United States as well, that PhDs or people who are doing research should wear red white coats and to distinguish them from the MDs or the clinicians who would be wearing white coats and so on. And I think that fell through. There's definitely a very long history to this.
Sure. So did you feel less than at times, or?
I never did. I think a lot of it is your personality. A lot of it is your own self-confidence and your assurance. I think a lot of it is also, in addition to your personality, in addition to your self-confidence, in addition to parameters that have to do with your core constituency, it has also to do with the environment that you're in. I think I was very lucky and privileged to be in very strong research environments. If it's Cornell, if it's Columbia, I was for a time I was at the University of British Columbia. I was visiting at different universities, and I always felt that I was treated very well and equally. Together with my clinical peers. Degrees never meant anything to me. They still don't. I really judge people, by who they are and what they do, what they say, and the way that they behave. I don't judge them by their academic degrees or lack thereof.
I think that's good. So what is the next big thing that's happening in neuroscience, and how should we think about it?
Right. So I think if you asked, 5 different neuroscientists, what is the next big thing, you will probably get 54 different answers, depending, on their inclinations and their particular training and their thinking. I'm happy to share with you my own. Okay. And I think that whatever I'm going to tell you in the next few seconds is going to be something that certainly a lot of my peers would line up with. It doesn't represent just my thinking. It probably represents, a small group of people who think like me. It doesn't mean that we're right, but it means that, that's what we're thinking. So one of the big, next big thing in neuroscience would be psychedelic drugs, for example. Psychedelic drugs are making a big comeback to the clinical scene. We are beginning to see a lot of interest and a lot of activity, scientific activity, medical activity around drugs that we have already forgotten about or we have sort of stashed away because of all kinds of cultural baggage and all kinds of legal issues and stuff like that. So hallucinogenics like LSD and psilocybin, which are considered, magic mushrooms, and peyote and ayahuasca, and all these names that some people don't recognize and some people do recognize. These are psychoactive materials that people have taken for thousands of years, really, but in the United States and certainly in the West, I would say, those were largely banned sometime around the 50s, 60s, depending on exactly what was going on. In the United States, the Vietnam War and, the whole hippie movement and peace and stuff like that is very familiar to a lot of people, particularly in Southern California. This has been going on for a while, and as a result of that, some of these drugs have been stigmatized and criminalized, and they sort of fell out of favor. Clinicians stopped using them. You're not even allowed to possess them. They're considered Schedule I drugs. You cannot even be around them. It's so dangerous because the police are, very strict about these things. Today, there's a movement afoot to decriminalize these drugs. People are beginning to use them either as citizen science. People are beginning to grow them in their closets. You can buy on Amazon, you can buy spore kits with these things. There's some kind of an underground movement where the authorities are sort of giving it the blind eye. They know that it's going on and they're sort of giving it the blind eye. And the reason is that we are beginning to we're getting to a point where we're beginning to get disillusioned with some of the mainstay drugs, or maybe I should call them backbone drugs that we've been using, for example, in psychiatry. If we're looking at, let's say, antidepressants, antidepressants have been with us for a few decades, and they haven't delivered. They're not actually relieving depression in the way that we were promised. They're not actually doing what we hoped or what we had hoped that they would do. As a result of this disillusionment or disenchantment, whatever you want to call it, with, let's say, antidepressants, you're beginning to see some promising results with drugs like psychedelics, and the combination of the two is fueling investors and donors and philanthropic organizations and even companies that are being traded on NASDAQ and IPOs and stuff like that to come out, and a lot of money is being poured into startup companies.
What does it really do to the brain?
Depending on the material and the dosage, all kinds of things are happening, and we're trying to understand what it does to the brain. It really is a field that is, relatively speaking, virgin territory. And the reason it's virgin territory is because when it was a little bit more in the news, let's say in the 60s, we didn't have the equipment, the technology, the knowledge of the brain that we have today. So many of the accounts of people who were taking psychedelics were mostly politically slanted. They had to do with social status. They had to do with demonstration movements. They had to do with protests. They had to do with the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth. And today, people are taking it into the lab. People are studying exactly what's happening in the brain. And one of the things that we're beginning to see is that there's a lot of emphasis with psychedelic drugs on ego dissolution, on social activity, and on connectivity. People who are taking these drugs are able to activate parts of their brains in a way that is atypical to common wakefulness, and we get more connectivity between areas that usually do not connect. And if this is done judiciously, if this is done with proper supervision, and if this is done with proper screening, in other words, we can screen people who don't have heart conditions and mental health conditions and stuff like that. And if we can do it in a monitored environment where we control the quality of the drugs, the dosage of the drugs, the medical history of individuals, and we can monitor them during the experiences, and we have psychiatrists and neurologists, at the ready. We are learning a great deal about how these drugs can help not just mental health, but things that are related, for example, to even eating disorders and social phobias and so on and so forth. It's very interesting to notice that we are now at a very precarious stage in our social fabric, because with Corona and everything else that's going on, we are in a way awaiting a tsunami, of sorts, that is going to be a mental health tsunami that is going to come, basically knocking on our door.
Yeah.
And
That seems like the next really big thing is certainly so much mental health is going on. I want to say that we're going to talk more about this in just a moment. We're going to take a short commercial break.
And just a reminder that our host, Kathy Gardarian, has a book out called Feet to the Fire, Finding My Soul and Success. And it's something special. In this transformational memoir, Kathy shares her inspiring stories about how she found her own soul while climbing the corporate ladder. Relying on open-hearted love as her primary motivational tool, Kathy defied the traditional male business structure to become founder and CEO of her own company, Qualis International, a multi-million-dollar sales and distribution company with clients like Home Depot and 7-Eleven. Within these pages, Kathy emboldens readers to bravely hold their own feet to the fire while giving them the tools necessary to achieve deep, meaningful change in the midst of discomfort. With humility, humor, wisdom, and warmth, Kathy offers an alternative path to prosperity, using feminine principles that will empower women everywhere. As Deepak Chopra put it, Feet to the Fire is for anyone interested in true success. Using her own story as an example, Kathy offers useful, accessible tools for transformation, combining business with self-awareness. Simply visit feettothefires.com. That's feettothefires, plural.com.
Good. Well, we're back, and this whole thing about using drugs, on the brain. What do you, there's so much talk about what you can do, regarding aging. There's so many baby boomers that are interested in staying really sharp. And what about Alzheimer's and all of that? How does that impact that?
Yeah, I mean, we are living in a society where people are getting older. Longevity is increasing. We live for longer and longer, and we are interested in the quality of life. We're not interested in just living. We want to live, with a good quality of life, and that includes keeping our cognitive faculties intact and remembering things about our narrative history and about our families and what we did and stuff like that. So we are all terrified of cognitive impairments and Alzheimer's and so on, and that's only natural. It's human to be concerned about that. One of the interesting things, and these are research directions. So Alzheimer's has been a big black box for us for a long, long time. A lot of money has been poured into research, brain research and development of new drugs, and we've been largely unsuccessful. We haven't been able to come, with a magic bullet, not even with half a magic bullet. We've been able to get all kinds of interesting insights into the brain and what happens to the aging brain and so on, but we don't have a solution. We still don't have a solution. Recently, something interesting happened. The FDA actually approved a drug after 20 years of not approving anything that is related to Alzheimer's. Suddenly, recently, there was an approval of a drug, but there's so much commotion around that approval and whether it was exactly kosher and what was the process and were there any kind of political forces around it, and scientists have raised all kinds of objections and people have been fired and so on. So it's very clear that even the recent breakthrough, if you want to call it, in within double quotes or quotation marks, we're not quite there. What psychedelic drugs are offering is a weird hope that we would be able to activate the brain or connect parts of the brain in ways that otherwise would be difficult. What people are doing now more and more, and this is happening under the radar, it's just a social phenomena. People are beginning to microdose. Now, what is microdosing? Microdosing is not to be confused with tripping, with taking LSD or whatever and losing control for 8 hours or going on some kind of a journey for 8 hours and so on. It's exactly the opposite. It's taking a very, very, very low dose that hardly makes a dent in how you feel and what your perceptions are, and basically taking it every 3 or 4 days and adding like a drop or a little bit to your coffee. And this kind of approach, this philosophy of microdosing, which is almost like a California special. It was developed in North Cal. It was developed by people in Silicon Valley who were sort of experimenting, and some people swear by it. And we don't have a lot of science on it. It's mostly anecdotal evidence. It mostly comes from accounts of people who've done it. People have written books about it. There's a whole sort of underground network of dark internet people who are talking about it. But it's very interesting to see that psychedelic drugs are coming back. They're coming back in very, very low doses. People take just a tiny bit here and there. And as a result of this, they feel more creative. They feel more in control. Some people claim that they feel that this can replace their antidepressants or, now on the one hand, it's exciting. On the other hand, it's very dangerous because there's no science around it. And that's why I feel that it's my responsibility as well as my mission to come in and to study these things so that we would have slightly more, I would say, what's the word now here? Systematic ways of ascertaining and studying these things in a lab in a way that is both rigorous and methodical.
But we were talking earlier about mental health, which certainly you look around, there's really a lot going on. COVID has caused a lot of issues for people. Do you think that the microdosing could also help that?
It might. I think that at the end of the day, it's really a function of evidence. We need to collect data and we need to see what it does. We need to see what it does to young people and to older people. We need to see what it does to people who are under social stress and people who are under stress at work. Even stress is not a monolithic term. It comes in like different flavors and different aromas. So we need to get a better handle on what it is that we're trying to determine that these drugs are good for, at what dose, to what people, under what circumstances. And that's a whole, it's going to take years for these things to come out. But there is definitely a change in the thinking, both of the scientific community and on the part of law enforcement.
Yes, definitely. We have to find a way to, I think, solve some of the issues that are causing so many problems. And the gun violence is up. Everything, people are a little nutty today. And
Yeah, and the other, you mentioned to me before, when you said, can you identify sort of the next big thing?
Yes.
So there's no question to me that psychedelic drugs sort of, represent maybe the new revolution in psychiatry and mental health. But I think that there's another element that represents a revolution that is no smaller, maybe even greater, and that's the suggestion revolution. I think that we are now at a point where we're beginning to understand more and more about the science of suggestion, and particularly with Corona. And when we see what happens to our society with conspiracy theories, with fake news, with vaccinations and knowledge of vaccinations, with groups of people who are listening to speeches, and as a result of that, taking all kinds of actions. It tells you a great deal about how you can influence people, how you can change their behavior, how you can instigate them and propel them into action. And these are things that scientists have been studying for years, but not on the scale that we see them today. So with, social media, with things that are related to the proliferation of information and so on, suggestibility, suggestion, the science of suggestion, how to influence people and so on, is becoming a big, big topic of investigation.
Wow. Now, you have a book that's coming out. And so what will we read in your next book? It's called The Suggestible Brain. I find that so interesting title because that is what you're talking about.
Yeah, and this is a perfect segue into it, actually, because the book that I'm writing right now, it's probably going to be another year or so before it comes out, because that's the timeline of books. You probably know better than most people. But the idea of the suggestible brain is basically to demonstrate to individuals what are the mechanisms in the human brain that cause us to believe certain things, and as a result of our belief, as a result of our thinking, to change our physiology, and to change, in a way, our reality. So a lot of people don't quite understand that thinking is a tangible thing. They think of thinking as sort of a cerebral or ethereal, or something that is so abstract that you cannot capture it. But we are now at a point, at least in neuroscience, where we can actually it's not exactly take photographs of these processes, but we can trace these processes. We can measure them, or at least an indirect image of them, that we can capture with the technology that we have, with all kinds of imaging of the living human brain. And it gives us opportunities to say intelligent things, or things that are a little bit intelligent, about consciousness and about free will and about our ability to do things voluntarily versus not voluntarily.
Yeah. I've always been taught that thoughts are things,
Yeah,
and you can create your reality by how you think.
right, and sentences like "it's all in your mind" and things like that. These are good sentences, and there's a good amount of information to support them. But what we are beginning to see is that to say "it's all in your mind" is a lot more than just a cliche. You can actually break it down to elements of what are the brain mechanisms that allow certain people to respond to certain suggestions in a certain way. So what makes some people more suggestible than others? And if you know that some people are more suggestible, can you help them more, or can you help them in certain ways? So for example, can you identify who are going to be the people who are going to be most susceptible to, let's say, psychotherapy? Can you identify the people who would be good placebo responders? Can you identify people who would benefit more or would be prone to follow religious leaders more? They're likely to be more spiritual. They're likely to be more people who are going to be maybe more critical thinkers, less critical thinkers. People are likely to have like more imaginative kind of thinking. People who are going to have more magical thinking. These are very important things, and just like you can identify certain features, like IQ, like personality measures, and so on, we are now at an era where we are beginning to identify suggestion, suggestibility, how influenceable people are, how certain people can influence other people. And this is extremely important information when you are basically dealing with either things that you want to sell, things that you want to, have people follow, ideas that you want to, have people follow. Don't forget, people vote, and if you can, and if you can influence people to vote a certain way, if you can influence people to spend their money a certain way or to go for certain trends, you have a lot of power.
Yes. Wow. I remember the Dalai Lama once told me that you never think about what you don't want, and that you put your energy into what you want to see out in the world. And that's how you create your reality. Which part of what you're saying is in alignment with that?
The Dalai Lama is a very smart person. And I think that from a scientific perspective, we are making baby steps towards these kinds of, very deep, overarching statements like the one that you just made. But one thing is for sure, we are beginning to understand certain things that we didn't understand before. For example, we understand that we can change our body temperature, our core body temperature with thinking, by thinking certain things or by, imagining certain things. We are beginning to understand how we can change our pain thresholds. we are beginning to understand how we can even influence sugar levels, for diabetic people by telling them, that the sugar content of what they're eating is different from what it actually is. So if you tell them that something has a lot of sugar in it, their sugar level changes differently than if you tell them that it doesn't have a lot of sugar in it.
Really?
Although it's exactly the same, they're eating exactly the same thing. So, people, their feeling of how satiated they are, how full they are, is a function of the labels that you give certain things. So if you tell them that a particular shake is indulgent versus if you tell them that, it's just a regular diet shake, they're going to feel less full as a result of the label that you give the shake. And these are all things that we are studying the physiology of. In other words, it's not just based on what the person is telling me. We can actually see what, the hormones that are being released, the underlying physiology, and how it's actually coming to be, not because the person is telling me and playing some kind of a role enactment thing. This is not acting. This is not the theater. They're actually feeling it because it's actually happening.
So, suggestible brain. We look forward to that. So, well, how can people reach you?
I think the best way to reach me is just to go to the Chapman University Brain Institute website. And there's a portal there that allows to send me an email, and they can send me a question or, a request or, whatever they feel like sharing. And it's going to get to me. I might be a little bit slow to respond because I have a big volume of emails coming in, but I have some trusty assistants who are going to, print it out, bring it to my attention, and I'm usually pretty good at getting back to people.
Good. And I always like to ask because I love quotations. So what's one of your favorite quotations, and what is it, why is it important to you?
To me, and I know a lot of great quotations, at this point in my life, one of my favorite ones is under promise and over deliver, as opposed to over promise and under deliver. I think that especially when I deal with young people who always boast that they can, bake 20-minute brownies in 2 minutes and things like that, I always tell them, one good lesson for life, and certainly if you're dealing or you're going to be dealing with science or anything like that, under promise and over deliver. Oh. It's short and easy to remember.
Yes, I like that a lot. That's great. I am so happy you came today and shared your wisdom with everyone. And I want you to come back again. So we have to figure that out.
With pleasure, anytime.
Yes, that'd be great. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
And there you have it. Another episode of Finding Your Soul in Success, with leaders sharing their inspirational wisdom with Kathy Gardarian. For more information on her book or to hear past episodes, simply visit the site Feet to the Fires. That's feettothefires, plural.com. Right here in Orange County's only community radio station, OCTalkRadio.net.